It started with a quiet unease, the kind that keeps you awake at night, even when everything around you seems perfectly fine. Billionaire Richard Hale had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and a home that looked more like a palace than a house. But lately, none of that mattered. Ever since the accident that left his only son, Ethan, paralyzed, Richard's world had turned cold and heavy. The laughter that once filled the halls of the Hale mansion had been replaced by the soft hum of medical machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes on marble floors. Ethan was only 12, a bright, curious boy who used to race through the gardens with their golden retriever, Milo. Now, he spent his days in his wheelchair, mostly silent, staring out the window toward the old oak tree where he used to play. Richard tried everything to bring back his son's smile: the best doctors, therapists, even specialists from overseas. Nothing worked. Ethan's silence grew heavier each day, and soon Richard began to feel something else lurking in that silence, something he couldn't explain. When he hired a new maid, everything changed. Her name was Clara. She was quiet, polite, and seemed genuinely kind. She had gentle eyes and a way of speaking that even made the nurses feel calm. Richard wasn't sure why, but something about her presence unsettled him. Maybe it was the way Ethan seemed to react to her. For months, his son barely moved or spoke, but on Clara's first day, Richard thought he saw the faintest trace of a smile. It was so quick, he almost convinced himself he imagined it. Still, Richard couldn't shake his curiosity. He began to notice little things. Clara spending extra time in Ethan's room after everyone else had gone, whispers through the intercom late at night, and once, when he checked the hallway monitor, she was standing by the window holding Ethan's hand, tears in her eyes. None of this seemed wrong exactly, but something about it didn't sit right. He didn't want to believe there was anything strange about her, yet his instincts told him to be cautious. That's when he decided to install cameras, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that something was happening under his roof that he couldn't see. The system covered every corner of the mansion: the hallways, the kitchen, the living room, and most importantly, Ethan's bedroom. Richard told himself it was just for security, that any father would do the same. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He needed answers. For the first few days, nothing seemed unusual. Clara worked quietly, cared for Ethan tenderly, and never did anything that seemed out of line. But one night, when Richard couldn't sleep, he decided to check the footage again, and that's when he saw something that made his heart pound and his hands shake. The camera in Ethan's room showed Clara leaning close to his son, whispering something softly, something that made Ethan's eyes move for the first time in weeks. Then, slowly and possibly, Richard saw his son's fingers twitch. He froze, unable to look away. What was she saying to him? And how was Ethan responding when doctor said he couldn't? Richard leaned closer to the screen, his heart in his throat. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to see next would change everything. Richard stared at the screen, his eyes wide, hardly believing what he was seeing. For weeks, Ethan's doctors had told him there was no improvement, no hope of movement. Yet here it was, his son's fingers twitching ever so slightly, after Clara whispered something only Ethan could hear. The image was faint, the sound muted, but the sight of it made Richard's heart race. He replayed the clip over and over, each time noticing something new. The gentle way Clara touched Ethan's shoulder, the way his lips tried to move, the flicker of awareness in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, confused and uneasy. Could it be real? Was it possible that Ethan was responding to her in a way he never did with anyone else? The logical part of him wanted to believe it was coincidence, a muscle spasm, maybe just a trick of the light. But something deep inside told him it wasn't that simple. Clara's presence seemed to stir something in his son, something that medicine and machines had failed to reach. The next morning, Richard tried to act normal as he entered the dining room. Clara was already there, setting the table with her usual quiet grace. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said softly, her voice calm and warm. Ethan was by the window again, sunlight on his face, and for a brief second, Richard thought he saw his son's eyes follow her movements. He wanted to ask her about it, to demand answers, but he stopped himself. Instead, he watched. He watched how Clara spoke to Ethan as if he could reply. how she adjusted his blanket with care, how she smiled at him like he was still the boy who used to chase butterflies in the garden. It wasn't part of her job to talk to him that way, yet she did it every day, as if she knew something no one else did. Later, when Richard met with Dr. Lewis, the family physician, he mentioned what he thought he saw. The doctor smiled kindly but dismissed it. "Richard, you have to understand, sometimes our emotions can play tricks on us. You've been under a lot of stress." Richard nodded, though he wasn't convinced. The image of Ethan's fingers moving played again and again in his mind. He didn't imagine that. He was sure of it. Over the next few days, Richard found himself watching the cameras more often. It became a routine, one that made him feel both guilty and desperate. He saw Clara reading to Ethan, humming soft songs, and once even laughing quietly as if Ethan had said something to her. But what truly caught his attention was how often she turned toward the camera, as if she knew it was there. Not directly, not enough to make it obvious, but in subtle glances, like she could feel someone watching. One night, the storm outside was relentless. The power flickered, and for a few minutes, the cameras went black. When they came back on, Clara was sitting beside Ethan, holding his hand tightly. Her lips moved again, whispering something, and then, to Richard's disbelief, Ethan's head shifted ever so slightly toward her. His breathing changed. He wasn't still anymore. Richard leaned forward, his breath shallow. What was happening? How was she doing this? He turned up the volume, trying to catch her words, but all he heard was a faint hum, almost like a lullaby. The room grew colder, and for a moment, Richard felt an odd sensation, like the air itself was listening. The next morning, Clara arrived earlier than usual. When she passed Richard in the hall, she paused, her eyes meeting his for just a second longer than normal. "He slept peacefully last night," she said with a small smile. Then she added softly, "He's stronger than you think, Mr. Hale." Richard froze where he stood. He hadn't told her he'd been watching. He hadn't told anyone about the cameras. Yet somehow she knew Richard couldn't stop thinking about Clara's words. "He's stronger than you think." They echoed in his mind long after she left the room. How could she have known what he'd seen? He hadn't told anyone about the cameras, not even his head of security or the household staff. For the first time, Richard felt a strange mix of fear and fascination toward the woman he had hired only weeks ago. Who exactly was she? That night, he went through her file again. It looked ordinary enough. References, ID, previous employment at a care facility. Everything checked out. But something about her handwriting on the application caught his attention. The signature felt oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he had seen it before. He pushed the thought aside, convincing himself he was just being paranoid. Still, a question nagged at him. If she wasn't doing anything wrong, why did it all feel so mysterious? As the days passed, the changes in Ethan became harder to ignore. The doctors had no explanation for it, but Richard could see it clearly. His son's eyes followed people around the room. His fingers twitched more often. There were moments when his lips seemed to form silent words. And every single time Clara was nearby, she treated Ethan not as a patient, but as if he could still feel everything, hear everything. One afternoon, Richard overheard Clara speaking softly to Ethan while she thought no one was listening. "You can't give up now," she whispered. "He's watching and he's scared. But you're going to show him, aren't you?" Richard froze outside the door. "He's watching?" The words sent a chill down his spine. Did she mean him? Or was she talking about something else? Someone else? When he peeked through the doorway, Clara was brushing Ethan's hair back, her expression calm, almost protective. It didn't look suspicious. Yet every instinct in Richard told him there was more to her than met the eye. That night, he called a private investigator, a man named Graham who had handled sensitive cases for him before. "I need you to dig into someone," Richard said quietly. "Her name is Clara Miles. She's my son's caretaker." Graham hesitated. "You think she's a threat?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But she knows things she shouldn't. And I can't risk my son's safety." Over the next few days, Richard tried to keep his distance, acting as though nothing had changed. But inside, he was watching every move she made. The cameras recorded everything. her morning routines, how she spoke to Ethan, even how she sat in silence by his bedside after hours. Nothing looked harmful, and yet there were moments that didn't make sense. Sometimes the video feed glitched only in Ethan's room. Sometimes the camera light flickered when she entered, as if something interfered with the signal. Then one evening, Graham called back. "Richard, you might want to sit down for this," he said. "There's no record of a Clara Miles working at the facility listed on her resume. In fact, the name doesn't appear in any employment database at all for the last 5 years." Richard felt his chest tighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying whoever she is," Graham replied, "she's not who she claims to be." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made him alert. When the hallway clock struck midnight, he opened his laptop and pulled up the live feed from Ethan's room. Clara was there again, sitting beside Ethan, whispering. Only this time, something was different. The lights in the room dimmed slightly, and for a split second, Richard thought he saw Ethan's hand rise a few inches from the bed, slowly, shakily, and touch Clara's wrist. Richard's breath caught. His son, who hadn't moved on his own in months, had just done the impossible. But as he leaned closer to the screen, something else caught his eye. Clara's face had changed, her calm smile replaced by an expression of deep sadness. She turned her head slightly, looking directly at the camera. "Please stop watching, Mr. Hale," she whispered. "You're not ready to know the truth yet." The screen flickered, and then the feed went black. For several long seconds, Richard just sat there staring at the black screen, his reflection faintly visible on the laptop. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through his chest. Clara had spoken directly to him. She knew about the cameras. Again, but how? He hadn't told a soul, hadn't even written it down. Every logical explanation collapsed under the weight of what he had just witnessed. He tried refreshing the feed, but all he got was static. He checked the other cameras. Every single one was working except Ethan's room. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. He grabbed his phone, dialing the head of security, but stopped halfway through the call. What was he supposed to say? That his maid was somehow communicating through the surveillance system? It sounded insane, even to him. He closed the laptop, but the unease stayed with him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The next morning, Clara acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted Richard politely, served breakfast, and went about her duties with calm professionalism. Not a single hint that she had been in Ethan's room after midnight, or that she had spoken to him through a supposedly one-way camera. Richard watched her closely, tried to read something, anything, in her expression, but she was a wall of quiet composure. Later that afternoon, Graham called again. "I've dug a little deeper," he said. "There's something strange. The name Clara Miles did exist once, but the woman died 5 years ago in a car accident near Lakewood. The hospital records, the obituary, everything checks out." Richard went silent. His throat felt dry. "You're telling me she's—" "I don't know what I'm telling you," Graham cut in. "But whoever's in your house right now, she's using the identity of a dead woman." The words hit Richard like a blow. He felt his stomach twist. His first instinct was to confront her immediately, but something held him back. What if she was dangerous? What if Ethan was somehow caught in the middle of something he didn't understand? He decided to wait until nightfall to see for himself one last time what was really happening. When the mansion grew quiet and the staff retired for the evening, Richard sat again before his laptop, the same fear and curiosity churning inside him. He refreshed the feed, half expecting another blackout. But this time the camera came on. Clara was there beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand gently. Her face was calm, but her lips were moving again. Richard turned up the volume. For a moment, there was only the hum of static. Then her voice broke through, soft, trembling. "Ethan, you have to keep trying. Your father needs to see you to believe again." And then something impossible happened. Ethan's hand moved, clearly, deliberately, and his eyes opened. Not a twitch, not an illusion. His gaze locked on Clara's, and his lips parted as if to speak. Richard stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "Ethan," he whispered under his breath, tears forming in his eyes. His trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen between fear and hope. But just then, Clara turned her head toward the camera again, as though she had heard him through the screen. Her expression changed. The calmness faded, replaced by something urgent, almost pleading. "Mr. Hale, please," she whispered. "Don't come in here." "Not yet." Richard didn't listen. He bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his ears. The hallway lights flickered as thunder rumbled outside. By the time he reached Ethan's door, the air felt heavy, electric, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He hesitated only for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the monitor beside Ethan's bed. Clara stood beside him, her hand still on his. She turned toward Richard slowly, her eyes glistening in the low light. Ethan's chest was rising and falling on its own. No machine, no help. "Clara," Richard said, his voice unsteady, "what are you doing to my son?" She shook her head, tears slipping down her face. "I'm not hurting him," she said quietly. "I'm helping him remember." "Remember what?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. But before she could answer, the lights flickered again. The monitors flashed a strange pattern, and Ethan's eyes rolled upward. The air seemed to hum around them, a faint vibration that grew stronger by the second. Richard took a step forward, reaching for his son, but Clara raised a trembling hand to stop him. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "If you touch him now, you'll lose him." And just as Richard froze in place, Ethan's monitor emitted a long, steady tone, followed by an eerie silence that filled the entire room. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. The sound of the flat line filled the room, long and piercing, cutting through the storm outside. His heart seemed to stop with it. "Ethan!" he shouted, rushing forward. But Clara didn't move. She kept her hand on Ethan's chest, her eyes closed as if she were listening to something beyond the noise. "Don't touch him," she whispered again, her voice trembling but steady. Richard froze mid-step. The room felt different, colder somehow, heavier. He could feel the pressure in the air like before a lightning strike. Clara leaned closer to Ethan, her lips moving in silence. Then, suddenly, the monitor flickered. The flat line disappeared, replaced by a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Richard stared in disbelief. His son's chest rose again, shallow but real. "What did you do?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. How are you doing this?" Clara didn't answer right away. She turned toward him with tears in her eyes. "He wasn't gone," she said softly. "He was caught between two places. He's been trying to come back to you, but something has been holding him there." "Something?" Richard's voice was thick with confusion and fear. "What are you talking about?" Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting toward Ethan. "Do you remember the accident, Mr. Hale? The night it happened?" Richard's throat tightened. Of course he remembered. It was a night that changed everything. The night the brakes failed, the car flipped, and his wife didn't make it. Ethan had survived but never spoke again. For years, Richard blamed himself for driving that night. "What does that have to do with this?" he asked. Clara looked down, her hands shaking slightly. "Because the person who saved Ethan that night was me." Richard blinked, stunned. "That's impossible. You weren't there." "I was," she said quietly. "I was on that road. I was the nurse who pulled him from the car before it caught fire. I didn't make it out alive, Mr. Hale. That's why you couldn't find any records of me. I died that night." The words hit him like a thunderclap. He took a step back, his mind spinning. "No, that can't be true." "I've been here because he called me," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan never stopped calling for help. Even when his body couldn't move, his spirit remembered me. That's why I came." Richard's hands trembled. None of it made sense, yet deep down, something inside him told him she wasn't lying. Every strange thing he had seen, the flickering lights, the missing camera feed, the way she seemed to know things she shouldn't, all of it suddenly connected. But before he could speak again, the sound of static filled the room. The laptop on the table turned on by itself, the security feed flashing between cameras, until it landed on one. The feed from Ethan's room, just moments before the blackout. Except this time, the image showed something else entirely. Behind Clara and Ethan stood a faint silhouette, a figure, barely visible, standing near the window. It looked like a woman. Her outline shimmered like light reflecting on water, but there was no mistaking her face. Richard's heart stopped. It was his wife. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The figure in the video slowly turned its head toward the camera as if aware of being seen. Then, as the thunder roared outside, the screen went black again. Clara's voice broke the silence. "She's been trying to reach him, too," she said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "But she can't find peace until Ethan remembers what really happened that night." Richard stared at her, his mind torn between disbelief and dread. "What are you saying?" he whispered. Clara looked at him with a sadness that seemed deeper than anything human. "The accident wasn't an accident, Mr. Hale. Someone made sure those brakes failed." Richard's world tilted. The storm outside grew louder, wind howling through the cracks of the old mansion. "Who?" he asked, barely able to breathe. Clara looked toward the window, her voice almost breaking. "The truth has been inside this house all along, and now it's coming for you." Richard stood frozen, his mind racing. The storm outside pounded against the windows like it was trying to break in. Every word Clara said echoed inside him. Someone made sure those brakes failed. His throat went dry. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice barely steady. "Who will want to hurt my family?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You already know," she said softly. "You've just been too afraid to see it." Before Richard could respond, the lights flickered again. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavy, charged. The monitor beside Ethan's bed beeped erratically, then went silent. For a terrifying moment, everything stopped. Then Ethan's eyes opened wide, and he gasped for air. Clara held his hand tightly, whispering something only he could hear. "Ethan!" Richard rushed forward, kneeling beside him. His son's lips trembled. For the first time in months, he tried to speak. "Dad?" The word came out broken but real. Richard's eyes filled with tears. He gripped his son's hand, unable to believe it. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." Ethan's eyes darted toward Clara, then toward the door. "It wasn't an accident," he whispered weakly. She told me." Richard's heart pounded. "Who told you?" he asked. But before Ethan could answer, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. The security alarms blared, the lights dimming to a dull red glow. Richard turned toward the sound, his pulse racing. Clara stood still, her expression unreadable. "It's time," she whispered. The door to the room creaked open, and a man stepped inside, tall, dressed in black, water dripping from his coat. It was Graham. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Richard," he said calmly, his tone cold. "Some truths are better left buried." Richard's stomach dropped. "You," he said, disbelief flooding his voice. "You were my friend. You." "I was paid to keep things quiet," Graham interrupted, pulling a small device from his pocket. "The night of the accident, your wife found out where some of your company's money was really coming from. She was going to expose everything. They couldn't let that happen." Richard's world spun. He shook his head, stepping in front of Ethan protectively. "So you sabotaged my car?" Graham hesitated. "I didn't plan for your son to survive," he said quietly, "but I made sure no one would ever find out the truth." Clara moved forward then, her voice calm but firm. "You shouldn't have come back here, Graham." He turned toward her, sneering. "You're not even real. You're a ghost clinging to a mistake." "Maybe," she said softly, "but he deserves peace." Before Richard could understand what was happening, the lights flashed so brightly he had to shield his eyes. A powerful gust of wind swept through the room, knocking over a chair and scattering papers. When he opened his eyes again, Clara was standing between Graham and Ethan, her hand raised. The security feed on a laptop came to life again, showing the image of Richard's wife standing behind Clara, calm, radiant, and heartbreakingly real. Graham staggered backward, his face pale. "No," he whispered. "This isn't possible." Clara looked back at Richard one last time. "Tell him the truth," she said gently. "Tell Ethan what really happened." Richard's voice shook. "Your mother tried to protect us," he said, tears streaming down his face. She found out someone was stealing from the company, and she wouldn't stay quiet. I thought I could fix it before it got out, but I was too late. The night of the accident, it wasn't her fault. It was mine for not listening. Ethan's fingers tightened weakly around his father's hand. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered. "Mom's here." Graham tried to move toward the door, but the lights flashed again, and the room filled with a blinding white glow. When it faded, he was gone. The wind died down, and the house grew still. Clara turned toward Ethan, her eyes soft and peaceful now. "You're safe," she whispered. "Both of you are." She smiled faintly, then looked back at Richard. "She's waiting for him, Mr. Hale, but it's not time yet." Before he could respond, Clara's form began to fade, her outline shimmering until there was nothing left but the faint scent of jasmine in the air. The monitor beside Ethan beeped steadily again. His breathing was calm, his face relaxed. Richard knelt beside him, still in shock. "Ethan," he whispered, "you're okay." Ethan nodded slowly. "Dad, I saw Mom." Richard swallowed hard, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. "I know," he said quietly. "So did I." Outside, the storm finally began to fade. The first light of dawn crept through the window, washing the room in gold. But as Richard looked at the monitor one last time, he noticed something that made him pause. The camera in Ethan's room, the one that had gone dark so many times before, flickered back on, and for just a moment, in the reflection on the screen, Clara stood by the window, smiling. Then she was gone. As the police cars finally drove away and the flashing lights faded from the long driveway, silence returned to the Whitmore estate. But it wasn't the same silence that had filled it before. This one was softer, warmer, like the house itself could finally breathe again. Ethan sat by the window, the morning sun brushing across his pale face. His wheelchair stood nearby, but for the first time in months, he wasn't using it. He leaned on a cane, shaky but standing, while his father, Richard Whitmore, watched with a mixture of disbelief and quiet gratitude. The cameras, the secrets, the fear, it had all come to an end, though the memories would take time to fade. Nora stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together, her expression calm yet emotional. Richard approached her slowly, his voice low but sincere. "You could have left. You could have walked away after what you saw." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Ethan didn't need someone to walk away. He needed someone to believe. Those simple words carried more weight than anything Richard had heard in years. For a man who built empires and measured everything in profit, it was humbling to realize that the most valuable thing he'd ever lost was trust. And now, somehow, he was learning to earn it back. In the days that followed, the mansion changed. The staff who once moved like shadows now smiled freely. The air felt lighter. Ethan spent his mornings in the garden again, this time with Nora beside him, guiding him as he practiced taking slow, careful steps. Sometimes Richard would join them, sitting on the bench his late wife had once loved, watching his son laugh, a sound he hadn't heard in so long that it almost felt new. Yet, just when peace seemed to settle, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while checking the security system, Richard noticed an unfamiliar feed, a camera he hadn't installed. It was positioned in the guest house, the same one where Nora had stayed. His heart skipped a beat. He clicked it open, and to his surprise, the screen showed a small box sitting on the table with a folded note beside it. The note read simply, "For when the truth is ready." Richard went to the guest house immediately, his pulse racing. Inside, the room was spotless, the faint scent of lavender still in the air. The box was there, just as the camera had shown. Inside it, he found a collection of old photographs, his wife, young and smiling, holding a baby in her arms. But it wasn't Ethan. On the back of one photo, written in faded ink, were the words, "For her safety." The realization hit like a wave. Nora wasn't just a kind stranger who came to help. She was connected to their past in ways they couldn't yet understand. Maybe she'd come for Ethan, or maybe she'd come for closure. But whatever the truth was, she had brought healing with her, and perhaps one last mystery to uncover when the time was right. As Richard closed the box, He looked out the window toward the garden where Ethan was laughing with the family's old golden retriever. The world, once cold and calculated, now felt alive again. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "Some truths heal more than they hurt." The mansion that once held secrets now held second chances. And though not every question had been answered, one thing was certain: love, honesty, and hope had finally found their way back home.